Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, Margaret.
Yes, it is. It's lovely. David's
beautiful Melbourne weather
in this, and he's madly keen on talking about every film from the year dot. So he's going to have the first say about On the Waterfront.
The first thing I want to know is, have you all seen it? Yes. Okay. Now, all...
Isn't he beautiful? Isn't she beautiful? I mean, that's just an aside.
As I'm sure you know, all films, any film, needs to be seen in context. A film reflects the place and the time that it was made. So Gone with the Wind is as much about America in 1939 as it is about the Civil War. If ever a film needed absolute context, it's On the Waterfront. Because On the Waterfront, on one level, is a thriller, and on that level, quite a good one, very good one. But on a lower level, on another level, it's something else altogether. Now, how many of you know about the Blacklist? Okay, not very many. So I will very quickly try and explain that, because that is the crucial background to this film. Before the Second World War began, when many Americans were isolationist, in other words, they didn't want to become involved in a war in Europe, the American Congress set up the House Un-American Activities Committee, called HUAC, to investigate un-American activities in the United States. And by the time the Second World War ended, and remember that the Soviet Union, or Russia, communist country, was allied with America against Germany during the Second World War. And quite a few American films during the war were made which were praising the bravery of the Russians. Now, that was fine during the war, but by the late 1940s, when the Soviet Union was putting out its tentacles right across Eastern Europe, and many of the countries of Eastern Europe were becoming communist countries, there was a fear among a lot of people in America that the whole world would become communist, including America. So the House Un-American Activities Committee stepped up its inquiries, but this time not so much about pro-German influences or whatever, but about communists. Whether there were communists who had infiltrated America, and particularly the film industry, because the film industry, this is in the years before television, the film industry was the most important means of mass communication. And there was a film director in Hollywood called Sam Wood, who had made some very good films, a couple of Marx Brothers films, and not Karl Marx, but the Marx Brothers, comedy team films, and other things, who was fanatically anti-communist, and who wrote letters to Washington to say how many communists there were among writers, directors, and actors in Hollywood. So HUAC decided to hold hearings into communist infiltration in Hollywood. People who were suspect were called before that committee, a congressional committee. They could be had for contempt of Congress if they refused to testify. And 10 men, 8 of them writers, 1 a director and 1 a producer, were sent to prison because they refused to answer the questions of the committee, because they said that it was nobody's business but theirs what their political party was. Now, again, I have to sort of try and put this into some sort of context. Just imagine that today you, how old are you, 17, 18? Okay. Supposing you become a member of the Greens, or you go to Greens meetings, or you go to a rally against the Iraq War, against the war in Afghanistan, or something like that, which you feel passionately about as a young person. And then in 15 or 20 years later, that act is considered traitorous because the mood has changed. That's what happened for an awful lot of people. In the 1930s, when, for example, there was a civil war in Spain, and a lot of people on the left joined political parties, which was perfectly legal and perfectly okay to do. But 20 years later, or less, suddenly it became treasonous, what they had done. So it meant that people were called, actors and directors and writers were called before this committee and asked to not only say if they had ever been a member of the Communist Party, but that wasn't enough. They could say, yes, I was back in 1932, but I haven't been for many years. But that wasn't enough. They then had to go on and name the names of anyone else they knew who had been a member. Now, and unless they did that, their careers could be ruined. They could be blacklisted. And if you were blacklisted, if you were an actor, that was the end. And many, many actors were blacklisted because they refused to, in a sense, betray their friends. Now, you can understand that. If you've been in some sort of group, it's all very well for you to admit 20 years later, yes, I was a member of this group for a short period of time, but I haven't been for 10 years. But then to be expected to name your friends who were also in the group, maybe they weren't your friends, but whoever, that's a big thing. So many people refused to do it. And if they refused, their careers were finished. For an actor, it was impossible to work because their faces were known. Writers sometimes took on different names and wrote scripts under different names so that they would be able to continue working. And there was a tremendous irony in 1956 when the Oscar for Best Screenplay was won by an actor who actually didn't exist. So when they called out his name, nobody turned up to pick up the Oscar because he was a blacklisted writer who was writing under a pseudonym. Some of these people left America, went to Europe to work there, either in France or in England, and resumed their careers in that way. It was a very, very, very bad time. Now, Elia Kazan, who directed On the Waterfront, had been in his 20s, in his early 20s, had worked for the Group Theatre. This is in the early 1930s. He'd worked for the Group Theatre in New York, which was a left-wing theatre. He estimates in his autobiography that maybe 2/3 of the people he worked with at the Group Theatre were communists. He was called upon to testify, and initially he refused. Then he realized that his career, and he had a very successful career in theatre and in film, he realized that his career was in jeopardy. He had directed on the stage A Streetcar Named Desire, very successfully, in the late 1940s, and for that play he had discovered a brilliant young actor called Marlon Brando. In 1951, Kazan directed the film version of A Streetcar Named Desire, again with Marlon Brando. He had made other films as well, and they'd all been very, very successful. He was one of the hot young film directors and stage directors too. His career was absolutely at its peak. But in 1951 he expected A Streetcar Named Desire would win all the Oscars, and it didn't. And he was certain that was because the film industry knew that he had refused to testify. And so he writes in his autobiography that in 1952 he decided that he would request to be re-interviewed by HUAC, by the House Un-American Activities Committee. And this time, not only did he admit that he had once been a member of this group, but he named names. Now, the people he named, this is a very grey area here. He argues that most of them were already known to have been communists or former communists, so he didn't actually do anybody any damage. But it is also believed that there were people whose careers he personally, in giving that testimony, in saving himself, in other words, he ruined the careers of others. So he became a very controversial figure in Hollywood, as you can imagine. In fact, Marlon Brando, who was on the set of Julius Caesar, a film being made at MGM in 1952, when he heard the news, and it was front-page news in the newspapers that Elia Kazan had testified and named names, Brando said, "I will never work with him again." It was a matter of principle. It was a matter of honor, I guess you would say. You don't betray friends. Then the script for On the Waterfront came along. It was, I'm sure you've read or you've heard about the background to this screenplay. Arthur Miller, very great playwright, began this project based loosely on real events, strikers among the longshoremen in New York. But the final script was written by Bud Schulberg, who was another writer who had testified and named names to allow him to keep working. So you had a director and a writer, both of whom had testified. Now, there is no doubt in my mind, bearing all that in mind, that On the Waterfront is nothing more or less than a justification for betraying your friends. So in that context, the dock workers are Hollywood, the Hollywood community as a whole. The gang is the Communist Party. The hero, Terry Malloy, is Kazan himself. I'm sorry, my mobile phone is on. Isn't that terrible? I'll turn it on. Terry Malloy is Elia Kazan himself. It's very significant, I think, that the leader of the gang is called Friendly, the character played by Lee J. Cobb. There was a very prominent man in the media at the time the film was made called Fred Friendly. I don't know if any of you have seen the George Clooney film Good Night and Good Luck, but in that film George Clooney plays the character of Fred Friendly, who was a real-life character, who was a producer at CBS Television, and who was thought by many to be a communist. No question that calling the gang leader Friendly was a deliberate ploy by both Kazan and Schulberg. So you have the crucial scene in On the Waterfront is where Terry goes to testify against his former friends. Now, the way the film has been set up is that it's exactly the right thing for him to do. But nevertheless, I think that there's no question but that was Kazan and Schulberg's point. They wanted to say, under certain circumstances, it's okay. You can testify against your former colleagues. One more story before I throw to Margaret, because she's sitting here very patiently waiting for me to shut up. When Brando initially said he wouldn't do the film, the producer of the film, Sam Spiegel, and Kazan believed that he wouldn't do it. And so they cast around for another actor to play the part. And I don't know how much this will mean to many of you, but some of you will know who I'm talking about. The actor they decided to cast instead, when Brando wouldn't do it, was Frank Sinatra. Now, Frank Sinatra had just made a big impact. He was a singer, a crooner, very popular. But he just made a big impact in a film called From Here to Eternity, playing a non-singing part. And Kazan and Schulberg thought he could play Terry Malloy in On the Waterfront. The moment Brando heard that Sinatra was being seriously considered for this part, he got on the phone and said, "I'll do it." So much for principles. A couple of years later, when Sinatra and Brando were co-stars in a film called Guys and Dolls, there was a lot of tension between them over that. I'll shut up. Margaret.
No, it's fascinating. But you see, I almost mind that the external circumstances of Kazan, the Arthur Miller situation, Bud Schulberg, has become so imposed on this film, because if you just take the film by itself, it's got Brando in a magnificent performance, as a guy who is redeemed by, a lovely little virginal Catholic girl, and and by a priest. I mean, I think it's significant that the role of the church as the moral guide in this film is. She is convent educated. She has got the moral values. She wants the murderer of her brother discovered, and she won't give up on it. And the priest, who is, you know, and she says to the priest, you know, what are you? You know, you're not out here on the streets, you're hiding in your church, as I say, you know, what are you doing? And she is the moral conscience for the priest, even, coming out of the church and onto the streets and onto the waterfront, which was actually shot on location in Hoboken in New York. And I think I love that essence of the film as well, that feeling that and it was absolutely bitterly cold filming that film. It was shot in winter, and you can almost see, you know, the faces. They look cold, they look poor. There are a lot of real extras used in the film, and I love that gritty feel of the reality of the setting. I love the story of redemption for this guy who's not too bright, who's been cheated of grandness, really. There's the famous scene, you know, I could have been a contender, because he was asked to duck fights for money, you know, for Johnny Friendly. And yet there is this tough exterior and this very sweet interior. I think some of the scenes between Brando and Eva Marie Saint are just so exquisitely tender and beautiful as he slowly reveals himself. So, I mean, I think you can, you know, take all of the external context of the film and load it on it. But despite that, Kazan came up with a really beautiful film. And you know, a lot of people. I was reading listening to the commentary on the soundtrack of the film by Richard Schickel and Jeff Young, both of one who wrote a biography on Brando and the other one a biography on Kazan. And, you know, they were saying that Kazan actually took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to justify his blabbing. So, I mean, and it was almost like the advertisement was an advertisement for what he'd done. If he hadn't done that, not nearly as many people would have known about it or talked about it or bothered about it or imposed it on this film. I mean, I thought, you know, and he and Arthur Miller were very good friends. And there was a major falling out because the studio wanted the union thugs to be communists, and Miller, who didn't name names, refused. I mean, Miller in his role wrote The Crucible, which is, you know, standing up against that sort of hysteria, and A View from the Bridge, which is his answer to this film. But I like it just as a film. I think it's so beautiful and real and poignant. I think it's a bit corny towards the end. And I think the speech that the priest makes down in the bowels of the ship is also a little bit long-winded and corny. And you know, the symbolic lifting of the body up out of the bowels of the ship is sort of like a little bit heavy-handed too. But the core of it is just, Brando at his most beautiful, I think.
I think. May I come back?
Yep.
I agree with you. I think it's a wonderful film. I think Kazan was a great director, and that's why he's such an interesting character. He was a great director, but I think in his private life he was one of the greatest assholes who ever worked in theatre and film. You only have to read his autobiography. You have to hand it to him that he is amazingly candid. He was a bastard, and he tells you that he was a bastard on every level. I mean, not only in this, you could argue about his testifying, but he was terrible to the women in his life. Awful, awful. So he was not a nice man, but he was a great filmmaker, and I think On the Waterfront is nearly a great film. Actually, my favourite scene in the film, which was an improvised scene, is the scene when Terry and Edie are walking out through that sort of rather bleak playground area, and they sit on the bench, and he's talking to her, and he puts her glove on his hand. I think that is such a touching and beautiful moment, and Brando does it so beautifully. So I'm full of respect for the film. You mentioned the clunkiness, or I think you said clunkiness, of the scene where the dead body is lifted up out of the bowels of the thing. Kazan talked about that. He said actually that's the only way you can lift the body out. That's the way they do it. So he didn't actually.
Oh, it's not.
He actually didn't intend it to be symbolic. He says.
Yes.
He said that was the way to do it.
Well, it's also the way he shot it.
Yes. I looked up this review, a contemporary review of the film, and I thought this was interesting because this is quite before we throw to questions, I'd just like to read you this and see what you think of this. This is actually particularly about the ending, which Margaret said she thought, what was the word you described?
Bit heavy-handed.
Bit heavy-handed. Okay. So this is actually a review of the film, which is writing about the ending, and it's written by an English writer called Lindsay Anderson, who at the time was a film critic, but who later became a director himself, made some very good films, This Sporting Life and If and other films. So he's writing about the ending, and he says, Terry's opposition to Friendly is personal. His concern is with himself. I was ratting on myself all those years, he says. So why then the ordeal? A desire to gain leadership through an impressive display of strength, or because he's urged into it by someone whose opinion he respects? The truth is, says Lindsay Anderson, this agonized pilgrimage down the quay is pointless. The mob has been discredited, the dockers have it in their power to be their own masters, yet instead of rising to the occasion, they turn like leaderless sheep in search of a new master. If Terry walks in, we walk in with him. If there's any principle expounded here, it is surely not that of democracy. Men collectively, the people, are shown as incapable of either self-government or mutual aid. The dock workers are craven. Even Friendly's ignominy is half accidental. He stumbles into the water. And when their oppressor is vanquished, the dockers find themselves lost. To whom do they turn? Well, to the new strong man. The conception of this sequence seems to me implicitly, if unconsciously, fascist. The impression is further emphasized by the behavior of the Catholic priest and of the girl. Leave him alone. Take your hands off him, says the priest. The blessing of the church is invoked on Terry's suffering. Edie, seeing her lover disappear, battered out of recognition, hardly able to stand, to perform a day's labour in the dockyard, smiles contentedly. The symbolism is unmistakable. The dockers stream out of the daylight into the dark. The priest and the girl smile. The last image, powerful and grim, is of the iron portcullis descending to shut the workers away in a shadowy and remote world of toil. It is a conclusion that can only be taken in two ways: as hopelessly, savagely ironic, or as fundamentally contemptuous, pretending to idealism, but in reality without either grace or joy or love. On the Waterfront is essentially an extremely artful conjuring trick. Underneath its brilliant technical surface, essential conclusions are evaded and replaced by a personal drama whose implications are entirely different. The potency of Marlon Brando is effectively employed to palm off a number of political assertions, all of them spurious, many of them pernicious.
It's interesting also that, you know, at the beginning of the film when Terry's in the clubhouse with Johnny Friendly, and the physicality of their relationship, because what Terry is doing is really betraying what he perceives of as family. You know, that Johnny's all over him, his body, you know. The Lee Cobb character is sort of leaning on it as he's leaning on the table. And it's his brother, played by Rod Steiger, who's also implicated. So I just think it's such an interesting film on so many levels. You know, the creation of family. He doesn't have parents. He's got a brother. They're both bereft. The brother's done well. He's failed. The brother's let him down. But he is a member of this family, and it's all he's got until Edie comes along. Look, we ought to let you ask questions too. That was
before we do. Just one last very quick thing, which I find a wonderful piece of irony. The film is everybody, no matter what you think of the film, and I must say I love the film actually, despite my reservations about it. But it is wonderfully photographed by Boris Kaufman. Boris Kaufman was Russian-Polish. His older brother was a man called Ziga Vertov, who worked in the Soviet film industry, the communist film industry in Russia, for many years. Among the films he made were Man with a Movie Camera and 3 Stories About Lenin. His younger brother photographed On the Waterfront. Ironic, I think. Yes, Margaret's right. We should open questions.
Is there any, what's your opinion about how much of On the Waterfront would you think is an answer to The Crucible by Arthur Miller? Do you think On the Waterfront was an answer to what Arthur Miller was exposing about keeping your mouth shut when you're being blamed?
I think they're two sides of the same question. The Crucible, which was interestingly made not into an American film but into a French film in the 50s. The Crucible takes the left-wing position. On the Waterfront, you could argue, takes the right-wing position. I think they're two sides of the same thing.
You know, I mean, I think they're both great works because they are...
I'm not denying that they're great works.
No, but I just was going to say that the political context is there in both. But in fact, what they are both are grand dramas. This one is about a man's redemption, really, isn't it? It's about a man who is, you know, prepared to be, you know, bullied around, take dives, be at the mercy of these hoodlums who use violence and horrible methods to keep everybody under their thumb. And they cheat these workers. They cheat them of proper wages, and they're pocketing all the dough. So within the context of the film, Terry it's his redemption ratting on these guys and saying, you know, I'm not going to let you get away with murder. The Crucible is all about, you know, the violence and hysteria of a mob community, really, isn't it? And it's a very strong statement against that. So,
just for the benefit of those who don't, The Crucible is a play set in Salem, Massachusetts, in the time of when the Puritans were finding witches among women who practiced witchcraft among the community, and then were torturing and persecuting these women. So Arthur Miller took the idea of the anti-communist witch hunt, with the sort of Reds under the beds idea that was so prevalent in the late 40s and early 50s in America, and transposed it into a story about literal witch hunting in Massachusetts in the 17th century or whatever it was, 18th century.
I mean, Kazan was actually a member of the Communist Party.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this group theatre, Lee J. Cobb was a member of the of the theatre. I mean, it wasn't so unusual at that time, and you know, in the 30s, and you know, sort of like by the 50s, it was all a bit of a no-no, because by this time also the Iron Curtain had come down. So, there was this major division in the world between the communist
But that's what I'm saying, making the analogy with the Greens today. You could easily be a member of the Greens today and find in 15 or 20 years' time that is considered by a new... That's the sort of analogy.
Well, David Stratton, you were on ASIO Files because you showed Russian films at the Sydney Film Festival. Whoa!
Let's hear from this questioner.
Is there a significance in the continuous reference to birds like the pigeons, the canaries and the crows? Oh, sorry, the eagles, yeah.
Margaret, do you want to answer that?
Well, you could go for the obvious stool pigeon thing, but in fact, and David will talk, maybe support this or not, but in the commentary that I heard, the character of Terry is one of the first representations of American males on screen that were, sort of conflicted in this tough exterior, sweet, yearning, soft interior. A lot of the Clark Gable roles were, men were very sure of themselves as men. The westerns were, sort of morality tales with, the strong good guy and the strong bad guy. And I think the pigeons just represent the soft side of the way he handles them when he's talking to her, handing her the pigeon egg. I think that's the significance of the pigeons for me, that it's Terry, and also taking on the role of looking after them after Edie's brother has been killed. So it's a guilty response for him as well. I've led to the murder of the carer of these pigeons, and now I have to take on the care of them. But I think there are all of those elements in the pigeon.
But they also give an opportunity for Kazan and Schulberg to demonstrate the reaction when Terry testifies, that the boy who used to help him with the pigeons kills them. And that is an extreme reaction. And Kazan, again, if you read his autobiography, he was amazed at the reaction against him after he testified. He was amazed. I don't know why he would have been, because I think any mug could have told him that there would be a reaction against it. But that's the way he felt. And that's so the pigeons are there also to be a sort of a...
I must say, I think that to me is a little bit of an inconsistency in the film. I mean, okay, I don't know why everybody turns on Terry after his testimony. I mean, they might be wary of him because they know he's next on the death list. He's the next one to be thrown from the top of a building. But I don't see why the reaction is so negative to him as a person.
But Margaret, it makes perfect sense in the context of what we've been talking about.
Well,
I mean, in the real intention of the film, it makes perfect sense because
I don't know that it does in the dramatic sense.
No, maybe not. But given that the film is an allegory, if you think it is, then it makes perfect sense.
You both seem to be in agreement that Kazan's a very powerful, very good director. Would you be able to point out some specific techniques that we might not have been initially picked up in his conveying the main ideas of the film to help us with our studies of it?
I think you only... on one level, you just have to look at it. Kazan was it's interesting that although he was a stage director first, and although many stage directors, when they move on to film, make rather stagey, static, talky movies, Kazan never did. From the very start, his films... he saw the potential of film, which of course is primarily visual rather more than the theatre is. So visually his films are all very strong, and scene after scene On the Waterfront, the way that it's shot, the angles from which it's shot, the use of, as Margaret has said, the the location photography in winter, incredibly realistic background setting. But he also, being a man of the theatre, uses dialogue really well and works with actors really well. It's sort of hard to believe now, for me anyway, but most of the actors in On the Waterfront were unknown. Almost unknown when the film was made. I mean, Rod Steiger had been in maybe one other film, who plays the brother. Carl Malden had been in, yes, he'd had small roles, but just sort of supporting roles. Lee J. Cobb, much the same. Eva Marie Saint, it was her first film. So really the only really well-known actor was Brando. But Kazan used them all in a sort of ensemble very well, although you could argue that Lee J. Cobb as Johnny Friendly overacts rather drastically in one or two scenes. But anyway, that's another thing. But Kazan was poetic, really, in his use, his visualization of the drama. If ever you have a chance to see his next film, the one he made after On the Waterfront, a film called East of Eden, in which he introduced another young actor, an amazing young actor called James Dean. And James Dean's first feature film was East of Eden. And it was made in a new widescreen system, CinemaScope. And Kazan was the first director to use the widescreen really well, which is interesting since he, as I say, is a man of the theatre. He was a great visualizer.
But you see, I actually think that for any director, I mean, what their role is in putting all these bits of films together is to create a believable whole that we are going to go along with, become engaged in, become challenged by, whatever. And I think that he does that so well in this. I mean, because for me, the key relationship in the film is the relationship between Terry and Edie. And I think there is such truth in those scenes. I really believe in him wanting to do the right thing by her. And I really believe in this young convent girl who's never even had a beer before in her life, somehow being attracted to this man, understanding that there is a soft, gentle side to him that she wants to access. And, oh, for goodness sake, it's Marlon Brando, you know. Not bad if you can get him. So, but that creation of believability is, for me, you know, sort of like what every good director is about. And, you know, I mean, some of those night scenes are so dramatically and beautifully shot as well. So, and you know, the scenes in the park, the fact that he does use real locations, and those actors just seem to fit into those scenes so well. I really love it. I'm sorry, I'm going overboard here.
How would you write an essay that asks you to explain Kazan's techniques?
With difficulty, I expect.
Like, because in some of the exams for English, they ask us to explain his techniques, so how would you two do that if you had to?
I'm very glad I don't have to.
Yeah, well, we have to.
Gosh, they punish you, don't they? Look, I think some of the things that we've been talking about here, I mean, On the Waterfront is such an interesting film because you can come at it from so many different angles. And you could certainly argue and make a case and write an essay about the fact that his techniques, his aims in making the film were what we said earlier, to justify his behaviour privately. That he Margaret will disagree with us, but it doesn't matter.
No. But I want to know what they mean by techniques. Do you mean where he puts the camera, where the low angle shots that he uses? Well, yes, you're going to have to go through the film and examine each scene, I would have thought, to understand what he's trying to achieve by the angles on the shots that he's using. I mean, that very stark black and white photography, is, you know, sort of like very representational of a rather gritty, cold environment. So, I mean, that's fine. But for those individual scenes, I think you're just going to have to go through and ask yourself, well, what is he saying here? Who is he putting in the foreground? Who are we looking up to here? Do you know what I mean? So just go through them. But, you know, in terms of technique, I mean, is casting technique on the part of a director? I would have thought so. So he plucks this young woman, even Marie Saint, out of obscurity and puts her in a film, and she's absolutely beautiful. He's used Brando before. He knows what Brando can do. He's a theatre director. He's able to cast extremely well. And he used real-life boxers and longshoremen in the film too. So he wanted that gritty feeling of a real environment in the film. I mean, it's sort of... how long is a piece of string in Turkey talking about? What techniques? You know, the production design in that. The production designer he chooses to work with. So,
and you could think about, you know, how he uses music, and if you think the music is effectively used in the film, it's a very,
yes, that's true.
It's a very sort of plaintive, low-key music score for a lot of the time. Whether you think that's effective or not, and so on. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can tease out.
You said that Arthur Miller and Kazan started writing the screenplay together, and I'm just curious to know how much of Arthur Miller was left.
Miller wrote a screenplay called The Hook, and that was... And when the studio wanted to make the bad guys communists, Miller said no, and he was out of it. And this screenplay is not Miller's, it's Schulberg's, and it's based on a series of articles that were written for, I can't remember which newspaper now, by a journalist reporting on real things in the waterfront and the mob control of the unions. And it's really interesting. I read that the mob did control the unions. I mean, this is really what was happening. And the film came out, everybody was very impressed with the film. There was an election for the unions after the film, and the bad guys got in again. So much for the power of movies.
Can we say Father Barry is a hero, and what do you think about that? Give us more example of it.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear it. But,
can we say that Father Barry is a hero?
Oh.
I think he's doing his job, and I think she gets him to do his job. That he is the moral compass, you know, in guiding Terry more than anybody else. So I don't think he's heroic so much as doing his job, actually.
I find him the most problematic character in the film, actually, but just the way he's used. But anyway, that's another thing. Okay.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I did, and you'll join me in thanking very much Margaret and David.
Thank you for coming. It's lovely to see you. Thank you. And I really enjoyed seeing the film again and thinking about it again.
I must say, I think it's great that you guys have to study On the Waterfront. When I was your age, we had to study, I don't know, Tolstoy or something, you know. That you can study a movie. It's wonderful. Thank you very much.